It's time for us to begin this morning. If you would like, you can open up your workbooks if you have them to, I think it's around lesson 33, 34 range in the printed copies. But we are going to be discussing the close of the kingdom of Judah just a little bit, and then move right into the rise of the Persian Empire and begin to think about that. Before we get any further, though, with our study, I want to encourage you, if you will, to bow with me in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today and the time we share in spiritual things. We thank you for your word, its instruction to us, and the way in which you have revealed yourself through the story of your people. Help us then to see whom you are in all facets and edges of their existence so that we can grow and mature our own understanding, not only of ourselves as human beings made in your image, but you as our creator, you as our sustainer, you as the fabric that is the universe around us. In all things we ask that you forgive us of our sins, and this is our prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so as mentioned, we have to kind of pay attention to some last tidbits and details here. As we're thinking about what's going on to create the context that will eventually produce what could be thought of as the cradle that will rise and produce both Israel and eventually present the opportunity for the Messiah or the anointed of God to come. There are some important theological things that happen in this time frame, both in the literature of the disciples generally, followers of God, but also more specifically there are historical tidbits, portions that are part of the chain of information that takes us from Jerusalem, destroyed, rebuilt, to Jesus. In this space that we call, most of the time, we call it kind of like the intertestamental period between the two testaments. Or we might use terms like the time of silence, speaking specifically to the lack of either oratory or literary prophets doing work at that time. No one was noted for being a speaker for God. No one was noted for being a writer for God in that time frame. But remember this is the tie-in that helps us put this together. When we get to the New Testament stories in the Gospels, we are introduced to a couple of individuals who kind of fill in that role. They are ones who are now serving as spokesmen for God in two different ways. The first category of them appear announcing the arrival of two boys. This is going to tie this together. Those are ones like some of the angels, and the interaction of the angels and the human beings that are then recorded for us. That's God interacting with us. And then we move forward just a little bit, and we find what is, I'm going to use it this way for today, the last common prophet of the Old Testament. Common in the sense they have a normal, ordinary birth, and in all senses and facets, aside from their job, their role in that regard, they are essentially like you and me. And that's John. John really serves as the last prophet of the Old Testament, and I categorize him personally as the last common prophet, because he has a similar origin to you and I. Born, raised in much the same generic manner. Jesus, though, also lives in that kind of middle space between these things. Born before the close of the Old Testament rules, the law, did prophesy, certainly did, and others did as well in lighter opportunities in the same sense, but not in an official capacity. He's identified as being equivalent to a prophet. He's the descended line of kings, and so he's uncommon prophet. He's our uncommon prophet because he is working in that regard both before and after the close of the law. There's a smaller group of individuals who are also prophets before the closure of the Old Testament. They may not necessarily all be inspired, because that's not revealed to us, but you can think specifically about the 70 who are sent out. They are sent out in advance of the New Testament, but before the close of the Old, and their message was to prepare for the change. Get ready, because the old way is gone, the new way is coming. And so by every standard, we have individuals who are speaking for God, by God telling them to do that. We don't know beyond this particular category of whether the things they said would be then now inspired in the way that the other prophets are. The record of their work is, but nothing is really listed out for them to be, hey, they spoke because God moved them to speak in this way. That's all important, because that creates the boundary. We then say, what do we have to pay attention to? In order to understand this history and geography context, we had to have some way to narrow it down. And so now we have kind of a canal to pay attention to. We've got to pay attention to what God's doing in this historical space. It's going to be advancing toward the arrival of Jesus, John, and the New Testament events. And so that will narrow our focus to pay attention to God's people a little bit more, particularly in that area. With Judah now being broken and all of the physical space being laid waste, there is going to be, again, our expectation of what's next. Last week we talked about Exodus 19 and that clause of if, of condition of if you obey my voice and you keep my covenant. Then we see how quickly they turned. Remember that from before. This will kind of help us stage to what we're thinking about for what happens afterwards, because the biblical text is pretty clear that Jeremiah had already indicated there is a capstone to their captivity. You're going to be captive for a period of time. You will eventually be set free. And so that kind of helps us get our timeline of consideration from, okay, now the temple has been destroyed, the city has been destroyed, Israel has been destroyed, Judah has been destroyed, the captives have been both scattered and placed. Some were put in certain locations, others were scattered throughout what we consider the empire. And this brings us to the time of return as the next historical event. But that also means we have to understand and recognize what else is going on. So in this last section, we're switching our brains over from the close of Judah and the close of Israel to bigger picture. There are a number of major events that occur that lead up to this. The first one for us is the Assyrian Empire coming and taking Israel. Nearly exclusively for right now, when we talk about Israel, we're talking about the northern kingdom. Other times that phrase is more generically used. Do you guys remember approximately when the Assyrians captured the northern kingdom or Israel? You got plus or minus 20 years in your answer. I'll let you go either way. But about when do you guys remember that happening? 750. He's so close. He's outside our 20-year plus or minus boundary. He's high. Feels like the price is right. Your answer was a little too high. So you can do some math and get really close there, because you got a plus or minus 20 window. What's the smart calculated answer? 730 is the smart calculated answer. That is within the window, because the answer to that is 721. I want you to picture our canal for a second. Everyone know what a canal is? It's a stream that's man-made, right? You just dig a ditch and then you put something through it. Here's our canal. It's got a sloped side. Our sloped side, one side of it is 721. We want to get across our canal to the other side. First group of captives go in 721 into captivity. They're going to have them branched off there on the side of that big ditch. Next major event for us to be aware of is the Babylonians. Guys, remember approximately when the Babylonians came down and now took care of all the scribes, the rests, the detritus. In this case, you also get a plus or minus 20-year window to give me an approximate answer of when you think the Babylonian captivity occurred. The last scrapes. And you can't be rich to answer this question. Rich is off the table. You got to be somebody else. Remember, we're going to work it in there like Price is Right. So if you give me a number, we'll get close to it, we'll move in.
686.
686 is super close. He's got half the math. That's a penmanship error. So that gives us closer. So what might be another one? That's about 100 years off. So that's a number you got to move by 100. I know you guys got to have more caffeine in the morning. You got to get up with my level of pre-caffeination to get ready with us. 612 is close to the math in my head. It's still not within our 20-year window, though. So we're getting closer. A little closer to our number. James, what do you think? James is not awake yet. He's not caffeinated yet either. I can see that in his face. 586 is our answer. All right? 686 with a typo. Could have been my typo. Could have been Les's typo. 586 BC. Now, these numbers aren't like, oh, I got to have it memorized. You got to have the general idea to see where the canal has been dug. And so they dug down the trench on one side, 721, 586. That's our floor, all right? That's where the bottom of this happens. Something else is going to be on the other. A couple other things are going to happen. These are uncommon ones. Don't feel like you have to remember these next two because they're not typical ones that you'll necessarily need to know. But it's what happens in our canal in the middle. What goes on in the middle of the rushing water between where we are and where we're going to go. We have to get across this canal, and so now we're seeing how deep it is. So the Medo-Persians eventually come and say, hey, Babylon, we're bigger than you. We're stronger than you. We want your stuff. That's universally what happens in the ancient world in antiquity between major empires. You can always find where the first crack in the wall was. Oh, it was this treaty, it was this personal problem. But the bottom line is when one empire takes over another empire, the general process going on is we're bigger, or we're stronger, or we're smarter, but we just want your stuff. We want your land, we want your people, we want everything. And so around 539 is our other edge of the floor. All right? So we've started over here 721. Israel goes into captivity. We get to 586. Judah now goes into captivity. Now there's nothing in Israel anymore. Someone put a rock in the stream around 539. Something happens here of importance. In this particular case, the Medo-Persians take over the Babylonians. That allows something else to happen. 536 is the last number you need to pay attention to because that's when people start coming out of the water on the other side. They've now gone through our ditch. They've suffered in all the ways possible. But now they start showing a series of returns. And you'll kind of notice that the return stories show three groups of people coming back. In the captivity stories, there's three groups that go in. There's one in between our 736 or 721 and 586 group. So now we're moving forward into what happens next as you're thinking about these events from the history timeline. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in the prophets. There's some history you'll pay attention to. And they are led by Zerubbabel, this last clump that goes out. What's interesting, this is a little side note, this is also the time period, and this is a funny thing for you to remember, where the names in the Bible progressively get easier to say. Whatever happens, something around the captivity phrase, the grammar, the vocabulary, starts making it a little easier for our English brains to put these words together. Because Zerubbabel, we can just kind of babble that one out, and as long as you're close, you're good. It's not like a lot of the Old Testament names, both Israelite and otherwise, that make us all sound like we have some sort of cold coughing up the end of the world. Something else to start kind of piecing together is how these things create our next step. And so we're thinking about the Persian or the Medo-Persian Empire. They originally interacted with Babylon out of this idea of, hey, we could just kind of coexist. Have you ever seen two different species of animals start their relationship that way? Hey, you're going to put you in the box. You got a cat and a dog. They're little, and their relationship seems to be pretty coexisting. What happens if the dog is 3 times the size of the cat in a few years? Does the dynamic shift? It can, unless the cat decides early on that they're going to be in charge. Nearly every cat decides that, by the way. That's their perspective on the world. And so if you put a big dog and a little cat in a box when they're kittens and little puppies, they mostly get along. Now, you take a big dog, a fill-sized dog, like one that most people can put a saddle on and ride. You put that critter in a box with a full-grown feline, any species. How's that going to go out for you? They ain't going to like each other at the least, even if they're super chill. Even if you put like a Newfoundland who doesn't care about the cat in the box with the cat, the cat is not going to like it. And Newfoundland's just going to be annoyed constantly. And they're so big that by the time they get annoyed, the cat will be projectiled just because of accidents. All right? So that's kind of what's happening in this sense of we're going to coexist between each other, because it never actually works that way with nation states. There's always human emotion and human desire that starts to pull, especially when the Medo-Persian Empire starts to really put tension on these things. Because they will eventually become an extremely large empire in the sense of how we look at them through the lens of history. One of the first major empires that would go ocean to ocean level size as we start thinking about it. And to a certain degree, bits and pieces of it existed all the way up till 1400. Because it became the framework that would eventually form the Roman Empire, which eventually became, the leftovers of that became the Ottoman Empire. And so you had this long major power that just changed names. They eventually often controlled the same things. And so you start looking at these together and thinking about what's going to happen. We've got an image here that will help us kind of see a picture of it. So our first thing is Assyria. We can see how much space they take up. Then we go to the Babylonian, and like, oh yeah, that looks pretty good. And we've always thought of Egypt, the Egyptian Empire, as powerful. Keep in mind, the power of the Egyptian Empire was not in land holdings. It was in their servant empire. They had a small leadership group up top that were all divinely placed, as they would think, and a lot of slaves. And so a slave-led empire, which is what they had, has a limit to what they can control. Because you've got to have masters devoted to keeping the slaves in line. As we might note that Israel and their slaves just left with God's help. And then the masters got upset. Then you move to our Babylonian and Median Empire context. You see that they're kind of bulging onto one another, and this coexistence can't really contain itself. And eventually the Persian Empire becomes massively dominant. It is from the corners of this empire that the Roman Empire would form, eventually even absorbing parts of North Africa, the Egyptian space, all the way up into what we would consider Western Europe, even to Great Britain, be all part of the Roman Empire at one point, way up into the northern parts of Western Europe, even into some further edges beyond our map perspective there. So this is then the cradle that Christ will be reared within. Even though it's not Roman overtook yet, its context is coming from this. And the mixing of peoples that happened in this era is really kind of what creates the context to have a Jew named Saul, from Tarsus, citizen of Rome, but citizen both of Israel and eventually the kingdom of God, in the biggest, longest perspective sense. This all happens in the microcosm of the Palestinian physical region, Old Testament Palestine, all the way into Israel, Palestine, all the way into New Testament Palestine. You now find cities that have architectural layers, archaeological layers, that follow all of these. So you can go to a number of them, and you can see, okay, here is all the Egyptian buildings. Here's where Egypt had its power. And then we can find the next major powers that come in, the Medo-Persians. And then we find the next major power that comes in, the Romans, etc. And you can see them all in the very same cities. If you want to have the most fun example of that, you can go to Jordan. How many of you guys have ever seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, I think it is? You see that movie? And one of the big scenes is Indiana Jones going through this little cave or kind of like canyon structure. It's called a wadi. And he comes out and he looks and he sees this carved in temple into the wall, right? That's called, the treasury inside Petra. And that community that lived there has its roots back to the time of Moses and Abraham, but all the way forward to after Christ. Their religious practices were like you and I at a potluck. If you go to a potluck, we go, I want a little of that, give me some of this, I want some of these over there. And so they would carve their mausoleums, which is all of what those are actually, for interning their deceased people from their communities. They're Roman, Egyptian, Persian, Greek, and all things in between. And they're carved into the rock through there, and you can kind of see them all smooshed together. They're cooler looking in Jordan. They're more archaeologically valuable when we're thinking about Israel for whether they have that purpose there. In this time frame, though, we get to encounter the rise of Cyrus. Cyrus comes from an obscure Persian province called Anshan. His mother is the daughter of Greek name I'm not going to pronounce, who was ruling over the Media area. And he first defeats Cyrus. This defeats us against a major battle. He moved to the capital of Ecbatana, conquering it in around 550 BC. So our clock is getting closer. He proclaimed himself ruler over the already large Median Empire. The Medes then were given positions of honor. Many of their customs and laws were then adopted into the Persian worldview. And we now have the beginning of what will become the Medo-Persian kingdom, which was going to be the largest kingdom probably in antiquity at this point, although we don't really know a whole lot about the various kingdoms that could have been present in South America to a level of detail of how physically big they were, because there's good cultural boundaries. I don't think they covered as much land without a doubt. But now we see this taking place. We've got kind of our picture of what's going on. Here's our two cities that we mentioned before, the location of this centrally. And we're going to see that some sections of this now are just mimicking the earlier empire. He would turn his attention then to what we would consider Asia Minor and start building out his power structure. And his next move would eventually to take care of the Babylonian Empire. A way to think of how this happens is to think about the hungry caterpillar. All right? How many of you read the book Hungry Caterpillar? If you haven't, go back and read it. You know, your kids probably need to hear it a second time, even if they're already super grown. If they're already in their 20s or 30s, you need to read it to them again. But the caterpillar context is really simple. If I took a caterpillar and armored it up so that Les and Linda could not kill this caterpillar, because what I'm about to do would be very devastating. And I went there and I found Linda's favorite plant in her yard. Linda, what's your favorite plant in your yard right now? The one that requires the least amount of work but still looks pretty? That's my favorite plant. So I find some rose that's just a perfect example, and I take that caterpillar and I say, just go to town. Linda can't touch you. You're protected. Eventually, what's going to happen to that plant with a caterpillar going around the edge on the leaves? Snack, snack, snack. Snack, snack, snack. Leaf by leaf. Eventually, you have a stick, if you're lucky. And then a cocoon appears hanging off what was ever left, right? That's the process of a caterpillar as it turns into its next evolution or execution of its existence. Well, that's what's going on here. Slowly, they start nibbling away, city by city, leaf by leaf, of the once mighty Babylonian Empire. And I want you to think, how often did Israel either beg Babylon for help, as a context, or fear Babylon? Well, if it was Israel, Northern Kingdom, all the time. Judah was more concerned with Egypt, and they would often try to beg Egypt for help or fear Egypt. Well, now, the bigger monster, our caterpillar, starts nibbling away, city by city, place by place. Eventually, where he is ready to attack the city of Babylon. He does so by digging a great ditch around the outside walls, and he diverts the Euphrates into the ditch so that he can go in and enter the city on a dry river. So he uses siege warfare in a new inventive way that was uncommon in the era and region on a scale that was new. It's not like they didn't know how to divert water, but now he had the forces, the power, the might, that even their powerful city, massive city, these cities, Babylon is not small by any measure, and these major capitals are not small. Some of them have a physical length of a perimeter of 200 miles. Some of them have physical land holdings that are similar to what we consider Atlanta. About how big it is Atlanta and how long it takes to drive around it. Okay, so that's all the little small cities and villages around it. The fortress would be smaller in the middle, but its held land is massive. And so Cyrus shifts the story. He is a different kind of ruler in that there are no mass killings, no chained captives. So the prior captivity context of leaders of these other nations, they're all brought in and either clipped to the ear, clipped to the nose. They're paraded as possessions. They're permanently marked in such a way that everyone would know that they once were a king, but now they are subservient to the true king. That's how these other captivities had gone. This is different. He would come in, capture, give leadership roles to the captive people. That shifts our story just a little bit and shifts our thought process. In this case, Darius the Mede is set up as king over the new Persian province of Babylon. So Babylon becomes like, oh yeah, you're still Babylon, but remember who's boss. And, O king, O governor, remember who put you there. You're in charge because I say you're in charge. Now think forward. We're talking about the time of Jesus, the time of the apostles. That's still how it was then. You'll notice how all the ruling parties, as they're aligned in these corners, are all concerned with making Rome happy, following Rome's rules, even though they might have ties to the land. Maybe they have a half relationship where one of the members of that couple was natively Israeli or Israelite. Doesn't matter. They're still now linked into the structure of this world. We can see both within the context of what happens and also paying attention to what is in the text of Daniel and in the other parts of the Old Testament, that captivity now is starting to be the past. And really we're going to be seeing the opportunity for them to be back home. I want you to think about this. Think about the travels of your family. How many of you have tracked your general family maneuver from first arrivals to the Americas to now? You guys done some of that? I've done a little bit. My family has done that. I've been the recipient of that information. My family moves through, arrive on the various coasts, and if you want an option of someone who's in my genetic line, we got pirates, we got people from every major continent, every ethnic group. We got the whole spectrum mingling into my family tree. Mostly, as you can see, tomato colored when put in the sun. So if you leave me out too long, I just turn red because I burn. But we got everything, from all major genetic groups. Pirates, criminals, leaders, military, got them all. And they filter their way. When you get down to the Martin edge of that, it goes through Tennessee, it goes to Oklahoma, and then it goes down to California. That's where that thread goes. What's interesting in that family maneuver, nobody ever goes back. If you go a generation or two, if you go 70 years, 3 generations forward, nobody in my family, on my end, that grew up on the west coast of things, moved to Joplin, Missouri, where a big chunk of Martins live. Literally no one who grew up in Trona and chose to leave went back to Trona. Trona is a little town where if you go to Trona and you know where Trona is, that there means you're related to me probably somehow or another at this point. It feels that way because ain't nobody else lived there. All right? But nobody goes back. Israel is unique in this regard, historically and culturally, that generations afterwards, they choose to return. That doesn't happen at this level in this part of history for the common person. You do see rulers go back and forth, but not the common person. They just kind of stay where they're at. It's a lot of work to move. How many of you are ready to say tomorrow we're going to sell your house and you're going to move 5 houses down? It's not even a long move. How many of you guys want to do that? Not a lick of us wants to do that, right? Okay, now we're going to move from Atlanta to Philadelphia. We're all going to move into Josh's house. Josh Gertler lives up that way. We're all going to hang out with him. I'm good. Is there another option? Is there an option planned, that has something different there? To a certain degree, we're seeing something a little bit uncommon, but God had foreordained and promised that they could do this. And their world was a little different. They're not happy in Babylon. Even when Daniel is at the zenith of his options, they are still prisoners. They still have to go and ask for permission to move. It's one of the many privileges of a modern world state, is that unless you're serving in the U.S. military or in some government service, you don't have to ask to move between state lines, do you? Paperwork has to happen, and lots of it, but it's never a permission. They're like, I went to the governor and he gave me permission to leave Colorado and move to Wyoming. That's not how it works. You go and says, I left Colorado, I moved to Wyoming, I need to change my paperwork. That's the basic context. This shifts here with Cyrus. It ties together with Isaiah's message. This is in Isaiah 44. And it's unique in that this is a first name reference. There are a number of biblical prophecies that support this and other edges. The concept of the return, the promise of the return, the idea of the return. This one is unique in that it gives a named king who at this point was not from a common spot. It's not like, hey, I'm going to pick the name John H. And he's going to sign the Declaration of Independence. Well, if you went back in the records of the early Americas, And you said, how many people are named John? That's a good large number, right? It's like Peyton for post-Peyton Manning era in Tennessee. And how many people got named Peyton, right? Every kid knows somebody named Peyton if you grew up in Tennessee, period. Sometimes you know like 4 or 5. So John was a common name. John H., a little smaller, still happened. John Hancock, okay, now you're getting narrower. In this case, this is not the same level of scale. Country wasn't around yet. Nation wasn't around yet. It's not like you're picking it while you're there. You're picking it 200 years in advance. Okay, so now go 200 years earlier than the Declaration of Independence. So this country exists. There's some potential knowledge of its place out there. Other people have been to the Americas. The Norsemen had already, Vikings, had already come across and been to what we would consider New England states. That had already happened. It was occupied. There's already folks living here. That's kind of the way to think about this prophetic pronouncement that a person who is going to rise is going to set you free, and his name will be Cyrus. That's in Isaiah 44. It's a pretty powerful prophetic detail. Now, it's important to keep this in context. When you talk to someone who is a biblical skeptic, if they are not already convinced with the idea of inspiration, their answer uniformly will be, Isaiah was written later. They'll tell you, oh no, that had to have been written later. Problem is that from a historical standpoint, these texts are old. They're not a new integration. We can find old extant copies of Isaiah's writings that place his work well before these events in various language contexts. And so we know that Isaiah existed. We know that Isaiah wrote. We know that he wrote, in some instances, parts of his text well before this. In the same grammar style of the completed versions that are newer. And so there's good, strong documentary evidence that this text of Isaiah is prior to the rise of Cyrus, not post the rise of Cyrus. But they're not going to be convinced because they've already decided. You're never going to convince someone to believe the Bible because of one word in it. You need to convince them that God exists and go from there. That's the general way to get them to be more comfortable. But for you and I, we can now see God's hand. If we already agree in the existence of God and agree that he has given us his word, now we get to see confirmation of that process in practice. And this is a great way to see that. It also then gives us something else powerful: trust. If God has that level of specificity in advance of events, when Jesus comes back and says the second time, hey, you know what? I care about you like I care about all the lilies and all the birds, and I'll provide for you. Now we have trust. Trust for care, trust for compassion, trust for interpersonal knowledge, that he knows you deeply on a personal level. He counts the hairs in your head. And for those of us who are watching our hair go away, that number gets easier and easier to count, but he still counts them, right? And that's our second bell. That's our first bell. Les is in charge of the class. You didn't know that. And maybe you think that I'm the one up here who's in charge. Les has the button. You press that second button, we're done. This ties together with what God has going down, and it now helps us see that 70 years of captivity are closing. That's generations who have never seen Israel, but some who still remember. Some who would have gone into captivity when they were young would be able to go back as a freed person and see it again. This is a momentary self-test. You have 3 minutes, if you want, to see if you can put these all in some semblance of an order. If you're in the printed books, you could have gotten ahead and seen that this was there, and maybe you thought about doing it yourself. But think through this and try to do it this way. You can either write them all down, and like this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. But look at one and go this. Is it early, middle, or late for the list? Which of these items happened earlier? Which of these happens later? And then if you don't know, then where does it go? It's not early or later, it's in the middle. That will then help you figure out the order. Because some of these are pretty obviously early options, right? In the list, it's pretty easy that promises to Abraham have to go early, right? Because everything else on the list is after that. And then we can think, well, you know, they got to get out of Egypt. From Egypt, they've got to get lost for a little while. Then they got to take the land. Then they're going to have to spread out the land, divide it. Then you're going to have the mess that is Judges and all that happens in that sequence of events. And then you're going to have the kingdoms all united, 3+1 kind of space of leadership there. And then if it's united, it goes to divided. That's easy math for me. I like that one. And then we're going to have the Assyrian Empire arrive, fall of Israel. And then you're going to have the Babylonian Empire arrive, which is going to lead to the fall of Judah. Then you're going to have the captivity takes place where everyone is in the captive period. And then the Persians are the capstone on this, where they take the last part of it. That then gives us a cohesive space to think about post-captivity to pre-Christ. That's the next phase of us thinking about this historically. And if you go back to what we talked about at the beginning, you've now seen the history go down, down, down into the captive canal, the ditch that's dug for them. And we've now seen them start their returns. First group, second group, third group will all come out and repopulate the land. They will rebuild Jerusalem. They will rebuild a temple which is like the old temple, but not the old temple. It will begin what we call, and this is the other thing, you have the intertestamental period. That's the Bible term academically and socially for this era. But we have the historical term. This is going to start in history what is called the Second Temple period. It goes from right here, around mid-500s, all the way past Jesus into the final eradication of Israelite power in Palestine, well past the destruction of Jerusalem into the last bits of armed conflict between the Roman Empire and Jewish nationals, we might think of them that way. These are last bits of zealots, last bits of troublemakers that from the perspective of the Romans are all crushed. And so this is when you have stories like the siege of Masada, the destruction of the whole city of Jerusalem, and the final crushing of all the strongholds in Israel that are flipped over into Roman control completely. And it is now 10 seconds till when I think Les is going to hit the button. So unfortunately, that's the close of our class this morning. We'll continue to pay attention to this as we look into this intertestamental or Second Temple period next Sunday. Thanks, everybody.